The memo was dated March 17, 2005. It was written on palace letterhead. It was addressed to the Lord Chamberlain, the official responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of the royal household. And it contained a single sentence that would, when made public more than 2 decades later, destroy any remaining claim the palace could make about institutional ignorance regarding Jeffrey Epstein's character and his activities. The sentence read, "We must discuss Mr. Epstein's continued presence at palace functions, given the serious allegations that have emerged regarding his conduct toward young women." This was not speculation. This was not rumor or innuendo. This was an official palace document written by a senior official acknowledging that palace leadership was aware of allegations against Epstein and that these allegations had raised serious questions about whether he should continue to have access to palace facilities and palace events. But the memo did not recommend that Epstein be banned from the palace. It did not suggest that palace officials should distance themselves from him. It did not propose any institutional action to limit his access or to investigate the allegations. Instead, the memo simply noted that discussion was needed, implying that the matter had not yet been officially addressed and that palace officials were still considering how to respond. What made the memo even more damaging was what came next. In the palace archives attached to this initial memo was a second document dated 2 weeks later. It was a response from the Lord Chamberlain to the official who had raised the concern. The response was brief, almost dismissive in tone. It stated, "The matter has been considered. Given Mr. Epstein's significant contributions to royal charitable causes, it is felt that any public distancing from him at this time would be counterproductive. We will monitor the situation, but take no action unless further developments warrant it." In other words, we know about the allegations, we know they are serious, but we are going to continue associating with him anyway because he gives us money. This was not a case of institutional ignorance that had been maintained through clever deception or through the deliberate compartmentalization of information. This was a case of institutional knowledge followed by institutional indifference. The palace knew. The palace had discussed it. The palace had made a conscious decision to prioritize Epstein's financial contributions over the seriousness of the allegations against him. The documents also revealed the extent to which Epstein had been embedded in palace operations. Guest lists from various palace functions showed Epstein's attendance at multiple state dinners, at royal garden parties, at ceremonial events. In some cases, Epstein had apparently been seated in positions of honor, near senior royals, near government officials, near influential figures in business and finance. The palace was not simply accepting his donations anonymously, it was providing him with visible, public association with the institution. It was legitimizing him. One particularly striking document showed Epstein's name on an invitation list for a state visit by the President of France. Epstein had apparently been invited as a guest of the palace, had attended the state dinner, and had been photographed in formal dress alongside members of the royal family and senior government officials. The photograph had been released to the media, a photograph in which Epstein appeared to be an accepted and valued member of the palace's inner circles. The palace's explanation for Epstein's presence at these events was that he was a major donor and philanthropist, and that major donors were routinely invited to palace functions as a matter of protocol. But this explanation ignored a crucial fact. By 2005, when the Lord Chamberlain was acknowledging allegations against Epstein, the palace knew that those allegations were serious. The palace knew that Epstein was the subject of formal complaints and investigations, and yet the palace continued to invite him to high-profile events, continued to provide him with access and legitimacy, and continued to publicly associate itself with him. The impact of the palace's decision became clearer when investigators examined Epstein's own records. Epstein had apparently kept detailed files documenting his access to palace functions, his interactions with senior palace officials, and his cultivation of relationships with members of the royal family. In these files, Epstein had repeatedly referenced his palace connections as evidence of his respectability and his legitimacy. He had apparently used palace photographs, photographs showing him alongside royals, in his marketing materials, in his fundraising pitches, and in his efforts to cultivate relationships with other wealthy individuals. In essence, the palace had provided Epstein with exactly what he needed most, a patina of institutional legitimacy that made it easier for him to move in elite circles, to gain access to potential victims, and to neutralize concerns about his character. And the palace had done this knowingly, with full awareness of the allegations against him, in exchange for charitable donations. Catherine, when confronted with evidence of the palace's conscious decision to maintain Epstein's access despite knowledge of allegations against him, made an extraordinarily powerful statement. Rather than defending the institution or attempting to minimize what the documents revealed, Catherine issued a statement that explicitly acknowledged institutional complicity. She stated, "The palace was presented with serious allegations against an individual. The palace had the power to remove that individual's access to palace facilities, to cease public association with him, and to signal clearly that such behavior was unacceptable. Instead, the palace chose to maintain that access, to continue that association, and to prioritize financial benefit over moral responsibility. This was not a failure of oversight. This was a conscious institutional choice." The revelation of the 2005 memo and the Lord Chamberlain's response sent shockwaves through Parliament. Members of Parliament began demanding answers about why palace officials had not been held accountable for their decision to prioritize Epstein's donations over the protection of potential victims. There were calls for criminal investigations into whether palace officials had been complicit in obstruction of justice or in covering up evidence of Epstein's crimes. King Charles was forced to make a public statement acknowledging that the palace had made a grave error in judgment. But the statement went further than simple acknowledgement of error. Charles stated, "The documents reveal that palace officials were presented with information about allegations against an individual and that they made a conscious decision to prioritize institutional interests over broader considerations of justice and accountability. This decision was wrong. It was morally indefensible, and it was fundamentally inconsistent with the values that the palace claims to represent." The revelation that palace officials had made a conscious, documented decision to maintain Epstein's access despite knowledge of serious allegations triggered what amounted to an institutional emergency within the palace. An emergency meeting was convened involving the Queen's private secretary, senior legal advisors, representatives from the palace's communications team, and senior members of the royal family. The meeting lasted nearly 8 hours and was marked by intense discussion about how to respond to the revelations and how to prevent further damage to the institution's credibility. The Lord Chamberlain, who had written the response memo, the official who had explicitly recommended that the palace continue its association with Epstein despite known allegations, had retired years earlier and was now in his 80s. He was tracked down by journalists and given an opportunity to respond to the revelations. His response was notably evasive. He claimed that he did not recall the specific memo. He claimed that the decision to maintain Epstein's access had been made at higher levels of the institution and that he had simply been implementing institutional policy. He claimed that the allegations against Epstein had not been as serious or as well documented in 2005 as they appeared to be in hindsight. But his denials were contradicted by the documents themselves. The memo he had written was in his handwriting. The response he had drafted was clearly his work. And the decision to prioritize Epstein's financial contributions over the seriousness of allegations against him was explicitly stated in language that was unambiguous and direct. The palace's institutional response was to launch yet another investigation, this time focused specifically on how the 2005 memo had been handled, why no action had been taken in response to it, and what had happened to the allegations that had prompted the memo in the first place. The investigation revealed a pattern of institutional dysfunction and institutional indifference that was even more troubling than the initial revelations had suggested. Multiple palace officials had apparently been aware of concerns about Epstein. These concerns had been documented in multiple memos, in multiple conversations, and in multiple meetings. And in nearly every case, the response had been the same: acknowledgement of the concerns, followed by a decision to take no action. The pattern suggested not institutional ignorance, but institutional deliberation, followed by institutional neglect. One particularly damaging finding emerged from the investigation. evidence that at least one palace official had apparently discussed the Epstein situation with someone in the Foreign Office who was responsible for vetting foreign visitors and foreign associates of the palace. The Foreign Office official had apparently recommended that Epstein be flagged as a potential security risk and that his access to palace facilities be restricted. But this recommendation had apparently been ignored by palace officials, who had instead continued to welcome Epstein to palace functions. This revelation raised serious questions about whether palace officials had been complicit in a form of institutional obstruction, whether they had deliberately ignored security warnings in order to maintain their relationship with a major donor. The implications were potentially criminal. If palace officials had been warned about security risks and had deliberately chosen to ignore those warnings, they could potentially be prosecuted for negligence or for obstruction of justice. William, now effectively functioning as the de facto leader of the palace in the wake of King Charles's declining health and advancing age, made the decision that the palace needed to cooperate fully with any investigations that might be launched. He issued a statement indicating that the palace would provide all relevant documents to law enforcement agencies, would make all current and former palace officials available for questioning, and would implement whatever institutional changes were necessary to ensure that such situations could not recur. This decision was controversial within palace circles. Senior courtiers argued that full cooperation with investigations would expose the institution to legal liability and would further damage its credibility. They argued that the palace should take the position that historical decisions, made with the information available at the time, could not be judged fairly by contemporary standards. They argued that the institution should protect itself and its officials from potential legal consequences. But William was unmoved by these arguments. He understood that the palace's credibility had been so severely damaged by the succession of revelations that attempting to protect institutional or individual officials from accountability would only deepen public distrust. The institution's only path forward was through complete transparency and complete cooperation with investigations, regardless of the consequences. Catherine supported William's decision and worked to implement it. She established a dedicated office within the palace specifically charged with responding to investigations and providing documents and information to external authorities. She implemented new protocols, ensuring that palace officials would cooperate fully with questioning and that no palace official would be permitted to invoke institutional privilege as a basis for refusing to testify or to provide information. The investigation into the palace's handling of the Epstein situation ultimately revealed that at least 3 senior palace officials had been aware of serious allegations against Epstein, had discussed those allegations in writing and in person, and had made conscious decisions to maintain the palace's relationship with him despite those allegations. While criminal charges were not ultimately filed, prosecutors determined that the evidence did not meet the threshold for criminal prosecution. The reputational damage to these officials was severe. One official chose to resign his position rather than face the public scrutiny that an investigation would entail. Another issued a public statement expressing remorse for his role in the decision-making process and acknowledging that his judgment had been seriously compromised by institutional loyalty and by financial considerations. The third initially attempted to defend his actions, but as additional documentary evidence emerged, he too issued a statement acknowledging that he had made a grave error in judgment. The broader institutional response was to implement comprehensive new oversight mechanisms specifically designed to ensure that future decisions about maintaining relationships with individuals who were the subject of serious allegations would be made at the highest levels of the institution, would be fully documented, and would be subject to scrutiny and challenge. New protocols were established requiring that any concerns about an individual's conduct would be immediately escalated through multiple channels, ensuring that information could not be suppressed or minimized by lower-level officials. The palace also commissioned a comprehensive external review of its decision-making processes and its institutional culture. The review was conducted by a team of organizational experts who had no prior connection to the palace and who were given complete access to palace records and to palace officials. The review's findings were scathing. It revealed that the palace had developed institutional mechanisms specifically designed to protect powerful individuals from accountability, to suppress information about institutional problems, and to prioritize institutional interests over broader considerations of justice and public welfare. By mid-2027, the revelations about the 2005 memo and the palace's conscious decision to maintain Epstein's access had become a central part of the narrative about the palace's institutional failures and about the broader crisis of institutional accountability that the Epstein documents had exposed. The memo served as definitive proof that the palace had not simply been deceived or manipulated. The palace had known. The palace had discussed it. The palace had made a choice. The ultimate consequence of the palace's decision to maintain Epstein's access despite knowledge of serious allegations was a fundamental transformation in how the institution understood its relationship to accountability and to justice. The 2005 memo had destroyed any remaining narrative that the palace had been a passive victim of Epstein's manipulation. The palace had been an active participant in enabling his access to elite circles, in legitimizing him, and in protecting him from the consequences of allegations against him. This realization forced a comprehensive reckoning within the institution. Palace officials who had been complicit in the decision to maintain Epstein's access were removed from their positions or chose to resign. The institutional culture that had enabled such decisions, a culture that prioritized institutional protection over moral responsibility, was systematically dismantled and replaced with new structures and new values. Catherine took the lead in articulating a new institutional philosophy. She emphasized that the palace's future credibility would depend not on its ability to protect its members from accountability, but on its willingness to hold them accountable, regardless of status or position. She emphasized that the palace had a responsibility not just to its own members, but to the broader public and to the victims of serious wrongdoing. And she committed the palace to a future in which justice and accountability would supersede institutional protection. King Charles, in one of his final major institutional acts before formally handing governance to William, issued a comprehensive statement about the palace's response to the Epstein crisis. The statement acknowledged that the palace had failed in its fundamental moral responsibilities. It acknowledged that palace officials had made conscious decisions to prioritize financial benefit over moral responsibility. And it committed the palace to a fundamentally different future, one built on genuine accountability, on authentic transparency, and on a commitment to justice that superseded the protection of privilege. The statement concluded with words that would define the palace's institutional trajectory going forward. We have been revealed to be an institution that was willing to compromise its values in exchange for financial benefit. We have been revealed to be an institution that prioritized the protection of the powerful over the protection of the vulnerable. These revelations are painful. They are humbling, but they also present an opportunity. We have the chance to become an institution that genuinely reflects the values we claim to represent, values of justice, of accountability, and of service to something larger than ourselves. William and Catherine, as the institutional leaders who would guide the palace into its future, understood that genuine transformation would require not just words, but sustained action over years and decades. The institutional reforms they implemented were comprehensive, systematic, and designed to address not just the symptoms of institutional failure, but the underlying cultural and structural factors that had enabled such failure in the first place. New governance structures were established that genuinely limited the power of individual officials to suppress information or to protect wrongdoing. New financial oversight mechanisms were put in place to ensure that donations from individuals with questionable backgrounds would be subject to rigorous vetting. New protocols were established for reporting and investigating concerns about the conduct of palace officials and members of the royal family. But perhaps most significantly, a new understanding of institutional responsibility emerged. The palace came to understand that its credibility did not depend on its ability to protect its members, but on its willingness to hold them accountable. It came to understand that genuine institutional strength came not from secrecy and institutional protection, but from transparency and accountability. And it came to understand that the palace's future, indeed the monarchy's future, depended on its willingness to demonstrate through sustained action that it was genuinely committed to justice and accountability, even when those commitments came at significant cost to the institution itself. The palace's response to the Epstein crisis, acknowledging institutional failures, removing complicit officials, implementing comprehensive reforms, and committing to a fundamentally different approach to governance became a model for how other institutions might respond to revelations of complicity in enabling serious wrongdoing. Universities, corporations, government agencies, and other major institutions began examining their own relationships with the Epstein network and began implementing similar transparency and accountability reforms. For the palace specifically, the crisis marked a definitive break with its past. The institution emerged from the Epstein scandal not destroyed, but fundamentally transformed. The monarchy had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, about the ways in which its traditional commitment to institutional protection had enabled serious wrongdoing, and about the ways in which wealth and power could corrupt institutional judgment. But the palace had also demonstrated something important, that genuine institutional transformation was possible. That institutions could, when faced with sufficient external pressure and with internal leadership committed to change, fundamentally alter their practices and their values. That accountability could be established even in institutions that had historically resisted it. And that the pursuit of justice could supersede the protection of privilege. By 2028, more than 2 years after the 3 million pages of Epstein documents had been released, the palace had become a demonstrably different institution than it had been. Not everything had changed. Institutional transformation is a slow and ongoing process, and there remained institutional resistance to some reforms. But the trajectory was clear and unmistakable. The palace was moving away from institutional protection and toward genuine accountability. The 2005 memo, the document that had revealed the palace's conscious decision to maintain Epstein's access despite knowledge of serious allegations, had become a symbol of this transformation. It represented the moment when the palace's comfortable narrative about institutional innocence had been destroyed by documentary evidence of institutional complicity. And it represented the beginning of the palace's long journey toward becoming an institution genuinely committed to justice and accountability. Catherine, as the institutional leader most associated with this transformation, would be remembered not as someone who defended the palace's past, but as someone who had the courage to acknowledge the past and to commit to a fundamentally different future. She represented a new generation of leadership that understood that institutional strength came not from the ability to hide wrongdoing, but from the willingness to confront it and to commit to genuine reform.